Alara Keene arrived in Redemption, leading a horse that was not hers. The dust of the long road had settled into the seams of her dress, a fine gray powder that matched the weariness around her eyes. She kept her hands at her sides, one fist loosely curled around the cracked leather of the reins. The horse, a stout bay gelding, limped beside her, favoring its left foreleg. The sky above was a pale, indifferent blue, stretching on forever. She did not look up at it. Her focus was on the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, a steady, rhythmic clang that was the town's heartbeat. It grew louder as she walked down the center of the wide, rutted street, past the mercantile and the land office. Faces appeared in windows, watching her progress. A woman alone with a lame horse. It was a story they thought they already knew. She felt their eyes on her back, the particular weight of unspoken judgment, but her shoulders remained straight. She had survived worse than judgment. The hammering stopped. The silence that fell in its place felt louder, more expectant. A man emerged from the deep shadow of the smithy, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. He was tall, built of the same sturdiness as the anvils he worked, and he moved with a deliberation that suggested nothing in his world happened by accident. His gaze took in the scene without haste, the woman, the horse, the way she stood, as if braced for a wind that hadn't yet begun to blow. Alara stopped a few feet from him. "This is your gelding," she said. Her voice was low and even, not asking for anything. "He threw a shoe about 5 miles east of here. Was wandering near the creek bed." Silas Blackwood looked at the horse's hoof, then back at her. "I see that." His eyes, the color of slate, met hers. They held no surprise, only a quiet assessment. She saw in them a weariness that mirrored her own, though his was older, more settled. "I put one on," she continued, gesturing toward the hoof with a slight nod of her head. "It's not a good fit. I had no forge, but it got him here. It won't hold much longer." He knelt, running a large, calloused hand down the horse's leg. He examined the makeshift shoe she had hammered cold onto the hoof. It was a poor job, but it was a job done. He recognized the sheer effort it must have taken. He rose to his full height again, his shadow falling over her. He said nothing of the shoe. He looked at her hands still holding the reins. They were chapped and raw, with a smudge of rust on one knuckle. Then he looked at her face, really looked, and saw the fine lines of exhaustion etched around her mouth. From the doorway of the small house attached to the smithy, a child appeared. A girl of about 6, with her father's dark hair and a serious expression. She held a wooden bird in one hand, its paint worn smooth. She watched Alara with an open, unwavering curiosity. Silas took the reins from Ilara's hand. The transfer was brief, their fingers not quite touching. "I'm making supper," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone he might use to describe the weather. "You should stay." Alara's first instinct was to refuse. To take nothing, to require nothing, was how she had learned to move through the world. But the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat drifted from the house, and a hunger she had been ignoring for days made itself known with a sharp, hollow ache. She looked from his steady face to the curious child in the doorway, and then back to him. She gave a single, spare nod. "All right." She did not say thank you. He did not seem to expect it. He simply turned and led the horse into the smithy, leaving her standing alone in the sudden quiet of the evening. The supper was a quiet affair. The table was long enough for 6, but they sat at one end, the three of them islands in a sea of wood. Silas at the head, his daughter, Maeve, on one side, and Alara on the other. The space between them was filled with the sounds of forks against plates and the low hiss of the lantern on the sideboard. The stew was thick with potatoes and carrots, the meat tender. Alara ate slowly, deliberately, as if reacquainting herself with the simple luxury of a hot meal she had not cooked herself. Maeve watched her, her small face a study in concentration. Finally, the child spoke into the silence. "Papa burns the biscuits," she announced, not as a complaint, but as an established truth of her world. Silas did not look up from his plate. He continued to eat, his expression unchanged. Alara glanced at the plate of biscuits in the center of the table. They were golden brown, perfectly risen. "These are not burnt," she said, her voice even. Maeve looked from the biscuits to Alara, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "you made them." Silas set his fork down. The small sound echoed in the room. He looked at Alara, a long, unreadable look. She met his gaze for a moment before turning her attention back to her plate. The house was clean, but it was the cleanliness of maintenance, not of life. Dust was kept at bay, floors were swept, but there was a stillness to the rooms, a sense of things left untouched. In the main room, on a high shelf, sat a sewing basket with a dark wooden lid. It had the look of something no one had opened in a long time, a quiet monument to a life that was no longer there. Alara had noticed it the moment she walked in. It was the kind of detail she was trained to see. After the plates were cleared, Silas stoked the fire while Maeve showed Alara the wooden bird, pointing out a chip in its wing. Alara ran a finger over the splintered wood. "That could be sanded smooth," she said. Maeve nodded, satisfied with this diagnosis. Silas turned from the hearth. "I need help in the house," he said, his voice as direct and unadorned as before. "The work is too much for me and the girl." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the house. "There's a room, board, and a small wage." It was a proposal of pure practicality. There was no pity in it, no charity. It was a transaction. He had a need. She had the appearance of competence. He did not ask about her past, where she had come from, or where she was going. He was a man who seemed to believe that the present moment was enough to contend with. Alara considered the offer. She looked around the quiet room, at the empty chairs, at the long table. She saw the years of silence contained within the walls. She looked at Maeve, who was now carefully placing her bird on the mantelpiece, her small back straight and serious. The girl needed more than a man's clumsy care. She needed a woman's hand. Not a mother, but something. A presence. Alara thought of the road ahead, of sleeping in barns and taking what meager work she could find, always moving, always alone. Here was a roof, here was a stove, here was a measure of peace, however provisional. She met Silas's steady gaze. "All right," she said. The single word hung in the air, as solid as the anvil in his smithy. He gave a short nod, the matter settled. Later, in the small, spare room at the back of the house, she lay on the narrow bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds. The creak of a floorboard as Silas moved through the house, the soft click of a latch as he checked the doors. It was the sound of a man securing his world for the night. For the first time in a long time, she was inside that world and not looking in from the road. She lay with her hands at her sides, listening until the house fell completely still. In the weeks that followed, the house began to find a new shape around her. Alara's presence was a quiet one, marked not by noise but by its effects. The bread that appeared on the cooling rack each morning was hers. The scent of dried herbs, which she hung from a beam in the kitchen, began to mingle with the old smells of wood smoke and iron. She mended Silas's work shirts, the needle moving in neat, efficient stitches that closed rents and fortified seams. She moved through his house with a purpose that did not disturb its long-held silences, but rather gave them a different quality. It was the difference between an empty room and a room where someone was quietly reading. She cleaned because it was the work she had agreed to. She cooked because people needed to eat. She moved through the town for supplies because that, too, was part of the arrangement. She did not perform emotion for the room. She did not offer unsolicited opinions. Her stillness, which some in town mistook for pride or coldness, was a form of dignity she had earned. She still saw the sewing basket on its high shelf. She dusted around it, her cloth moving carefully along the wood, but she did not touch the lid. It remained a closed book, a story she had no right to read. One morning at the mercantile, Mrs. Gable found her by the bolts of calico. The woman was the wife of the town's most prosperous rancher, a woman whose concern often arrived with the sharp edge of a blade. "Alara," she said, her voice pitched to carry. "I was so glad to hear you'd found a place. It must be a comfort after all you've been through." Alara turned. She held a small bag of buttons in her hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable. It's a Christian kindness Silas is showing you," the woman continued, her eyes scanning Alara's plain dress. "Such a tragedy, what happened to his dear Martha. The heart of that house, she was. It's been empty ever since." The implication was clear. The house was still empty, despite Alara's presence in it. Alara said nothing. She did not defend her position. She did not explain the nature of her arrangement with Silas. She simply met the woman's probing gaze with a quiet steadiness that offered no purchase. "I need to pay for these," she said, turning toward the counter where Mr. Henderson, the owner, was weighing out flour for another customer. He had heard the exchange as he heard everything in his store. He met Alara's eyes for a brief moment, a flicker of understanding passing between them, before he turned to ring up her purchase. Alara walked back to the smithy, the small bag of goods in her hand. The sun was higher now, bleaching the color from the landscape. She could hear the rhythmic report of Silas's hammer before she saw the building. He was at the forge, his back to her, his arm rising and falling with powerful economy. He did not turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her. He was aware of everything that moved in his domain. He had likely seen her talking to Mrs. Gable from a distance. He said nothing when she entered the house. But later, when he came in for the midday meal, she noticed the set of his jaw was tighter than usual. After he ate, he went back to the forge, and the blows of his hammer against the anvil were harder, more deliberate, ringing out across the quiet afternoon with a ferocity that seemed to be answering a question no one had asked aloud. The days found their shape after that. The arrangement, once provisional, settled into a rhythm as predictable as the sun's rising. The coffee Alara left for him on the warm back of the stove each morning was no longer a surprise, but a part of the day's beginning. He would drink it standing by the window, looking out at the weather before heading to the forge. He never commented on it, but the cup was always empty when she cleared it away. The unspoken exchange had become their primary language. Trust was not declared. It was built, one small, repeated action at a time. Maeve, who had at first been a silent observer, began to orbit closer to Alara. She started by leaving small gifts on the kitchen table, a bird's feather of an unusual blue, a smooth, flat stone from the creek, a gnarled piece of wood that looked like a sleeping animal. Alara would find them and place them together on the windowsill above the sink, a small, curated collection of the child's offerings. One afternoon, Maeve appeared at her elbow as she was kneading bread dough. The child held up her doll, a cloth figure with yarn hair that was coming undone. One of its button eyes was loose. "Can you fix her?" Maeve asked. Her voice was small, but the question was enormous. Alara looked at the doll then, her gaze lifted to the high shelf across the room, to the sewing basket. It sat in its usual place, a silent witness. She had the skill, the thread, the needles, but they were in there. Using them felt like a trespass she was not yet entitled to make. She looked back at the child's hopeful face. "I will have to ask your father," she said. That evening, as Silas sat by the fire cleaning a piece of harness, Alara approached. She stood with her hands at her sides, a posture he was coming to recognize as her way of bracing herself. "Your daughter has a doll that needs mending," she began, her voice even and practical. "I can fix it, but I will need a needle and thread." She did not look at the basket, but he knew exactly what she was asking. His hands stilled on the leather. He looked over at the shelf, his gaze resting on the dark wooden box. It had sat there for 4 years, a piece of the past he had not known how to move. He had not been able to bring himself to open it, nor to put it away. It was simply there, a testament to the woman who had been the heart of the house. Now, another woman was asking for permission to disturb that silence. He looked at Alara, at her calm, waiting face. She was not asking to replace anyone. She was asking to mend a child's toy. It was the most practical of requests, yet it felt momentous. He gave a short, sharp nod. "It's for the house," he said. The words were spare, but they were enough. They were permission. They were more than permission. That was the first thing that passed between them that neither of them had intended. It was not about a doll, or a needle, or a basket. It was about allowing a new hand to touch the things that had been consecrated to memory. Later that night, by the light of a single lamp, Alara lifted the basket down from the shelf. She wiped the thin layer of dust from the lid with the hem of her apron before opening it. A faint scent of dried lavender and old linen rose to meet her. Inside, spools of thread were arranged by color. Needles were tucked into a small velvet cushion shaped like a tomato, and a silver thimble sat in its own small compartment. It was the toolkit of a woman who had loved order. Alara found a spool of black thread and a fine needle. She sat at the table and, with careful, precise stitches, reattached the doll's button eye and secured the fraying yarn of its hair. She worked until the small figure was whole again, its painted smile no longer seeming quite so forlorn. The town continued to watch. Alara's continued presence at the smithy was a subject of low-murmured speculation over fences, and at the church social she did not attend. The talk, which had been a low hum, began to sharpen. Mrs. Gable, who saw herself as the guardian of the town's proprieties, decided the situation required a more direct intervention. She caught Silas as he was loading a set of new hinges into his wagon, his work for the week done. "Silas," she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy concern. "A moment." He turned slowly. He did not like being caught unawares. Mrs. Gable. "People are talking," she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is not my place to say, but as a friend of your dear Martha's, a woman in your house, and you not in mourning a full 5 years. It doesn't look right." Silas finished placing the last hinge in the wagon bed. He straightened up and met her gaze. His face was like stone. "She is a guest in my house," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had the flat, final sound of a door closing. He did not raise it. He did not elaborate. He simply stated the fact as he saw it. Without another word, he climbed onto the wagon seat and flicked the reins. He did not look back as he drove away. The dismissal was absolute. But the poison of the rumor mill, once started, was not so easily stopped. The talk curdled. Whispers began to circulate about Alara's own past, stories pieced together from half-truths and conjecture, that her husband's death on their claim had been too convenient, that she had left her own people under a cloud of suspicion, that she was an opportunist latching onto a lonely man with a child. The whispers reached Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile. One afternoon, as Mrs. Gable was holding court near the pickle barrel, he heard her mention Alara's name in a low, suggestive tone. He came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He walked over to the sugar bin and began scooping sugar into a bag for another customer, his movements methodical. "I knew her father," he said into the sudden quiet, his voice calm but carrying, Abel Keene, an honest man. Broke his leg setting a fence post and never complained. His daughter takes after him. He tied the bag of sugar with a neat knot. "She's had a hard road. Some folks have a talent for finding the rockiest path. Others have it laid out for them whether they want it or not. Leave her be." He handed the bag to his customer. Mrs. Gable fell silent, her lips tight with indignation. The public defense, from a man as respected and taciturn as Henderson, was a powerful rebuke. Silas, too, heard the rumors. They came to him as they came to everyone. On the wind, he said nothing of it to Alara. He could see the strain of it in the way she held her shoulders, in the slight tightening of her jaw when she returned from town. He knew she would never speak of it herself. One evening, she saw him out the front window. He was working on the porch, replacing the broken top step that had been a hazard for over a year. He had a lantern, a saw, and a stack of fresh-cut lumber. He worked with a steady, unhurried focus, measuring twice before each cut, fitting the new board into place with precision. It was a simple, practical act, a repair long overdue, but she understood what he was doing. He was not just fixing a step. He was shoring up the foundations. He was making the house more solid, more permanent. He was answering the whispers, not with words but with wood and nails. He was declaring, in his own quiet way, that she belonged inside its walls. She watched him until the light faded. Completely, the rhythmic scrape of his saw a reassuring sound against the growing dark. A late autumn storm blew in from the north, carrying the first real bite of winter. The wind howled around the corners of the house, rattling the window frames and sending gusts of smoke back down the chimney. Maeve, who was usually so stoic, grew quiet and wide-eyed. The fury of the wind seemed to find a crack in her young composure. She sat on the floor by the hearth, her doll held tight in her arms. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed a loose shutter against the side of the house with a loud crack. Maeve jumped, a small cry escaping her lips. Alara went to her, but she did not scoop her up or offer soft platitudes. She knelt beside the child and spoke in a low, practical tone. "It's just the wind," she said. "The south shutter is loose. We can fix it." She stood and retrieved a small wooden wedge from the kindling box. She held it out to Maeve. "Hold this," she said, "and the lantern. I need you to be my light." Giving the child a task, a purpose, was the surest way to dispel her fear. Maeve looked at the wedge, then at Alara's calm face. She took it, her small hand closing around the wood. She picked up the lantern, her expression serious. Together, they went to the rattling window. Alara worked the shutter back into place while Maeve held the lantern high, the small flame casting their dual shadows on the wall. "Now the wedge," Alara said. Maeve handed it to her. Alara worked it into the frame until the shutter was snug and silent. The rattling stopped. The only sound was the steady roar of the wind outside, now held at bay. Competence was its own form of comfort. Later, the storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a cold, clear night and a world washed clean. Silas came in from the barn, his shoulders damp with melted snow. The house was quiet. Maeve was asleep in her bed, the mended doll beside her. He found Alara sitting by the fire, a basket of his mending on the small table beside her. She was darning the elbow of one of his work shirts. The needle moved in and out of the worn fabric with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency. He stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her. The firelight caught the warm tones in her hair and softened the severe lines of her posture. She was so completely absorbed in her task, in the simple act of making something whole again. He walked over to the hearth and added a log to the fire. He did not thank her for the mending or for calming his daughter during the storm. Gratitude felt too small a word for what he was beginning to feel. He watched her hands, the way they moved with such certainty. "Where did you learn to be so steady?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it landed in the room with the weight of things long unsaid. She did not look up from her work. The needle did not pause. "My father taught me to set a bone before I could read," she said, her voice a low murmur. "He said, there are some things you can't cry over, you just have to fix them." It was the first real piece of her history she had ever offered him. A small, hard stone of a memory, given without preamble or explanation. He understood she was not just talking about a torn shirt or a broken bone. She was talking about her life. She was telling him how she had survived. He stood there for a long moment, taking it in. Then he turned and went to the stove where the coffee pot was still warm. He poured 2 cups. He walked back and placed one on the small table beside her chair, next to the mending basket. He had not asked if she wanted any. He simply provided it. It was an unspoken exchange, and they both knew it. She paused in her sewing, her hands resting for a moment on the worn fabric in her lap. He sat down in his own chair across the hearth. They drank their coffee in a shared, comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle hiss and crackle of the fire. A few weeks later, the first lasting snow of the season fell. It came down thick and silent, blanketing the hard, frozen ground in a layer of pristine white. The world seemed to hold its breath. That evening, after Maeve was asleep, Alara stepped out onto the porch. She wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders, the cold, air sharp against her face. The sky was clear, a deep, star-dusted indigo. She watched the smoke from the chimney rise in a straight, unwavering column into the still air. The door opened behind her, and Silas stepped out. He did not have a coat on, but the cold did not seem to touch him. He came to stand beside her, not touching, his presence a solid warmth in the chilled air. They stood like that for a time, two quiet figures, looking out at the new-made world. "The winter will be hard," he said finally. His voice was even, a simple statement of fact. And she nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant, dark line of the horizon. "It usually is." He turned his head to look at her. The faint light from the window caught the side of her face, illuminating the strong line of her jaw and the quiet resolve in her expression. He had seen that expression when she'd arrived with his horse, when she'd faced down Mrs. Gable, when she'd mended his daughter's doll. It was the face of a woman who bent but did not break. He had done what he had come out here to do. He kept his voice low and steady, as if he were discussing the price of iron. "I have this house," he began, laying out the facts. "I have my work and a daughter. He paused, and in that small silence, the true weight of his words gathered. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "as my wife." He added the final, crucial part, the part that made it a choice and not a command. "If that is what you want." Alara turned to face him fully. She looked into his eyes, searching for pity, or duty, or loneliness. She found none of those things. She saw only a quiet, steady certainty. He was not a man who spoke idly. He had weighed this, the way he weighed everything, and found it true. All her life, it seemed, she had been assessed and dismissed, judged for what she lacked, for what she was not. This man was not assessing her. He was seeing her. He was seeing her competence, her stillness, her resilience. And he was not asking her to be anything other than what she was. A feeling she could not name, a slow, deep thawing around her heart, rose up in her. It was the feeling of being truly known. She had learned to want so little as a form of self-protection. But here, in the cold, clear dark, was something she could allow herself to want. Her answer, when it came, was as plain and unadorned as his question. Yes. The word was barely a whisper, but it was absolute. "So there could be no doubt," she added. "That is what I want." Silas held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of triumph or pride, but something quieter, the settling of a man who has finished a long and difficult job. The matter was concluded. He said nothing more. He did not try to kiss her or touch her. The declaration had been made and accepted. That was enough. He turned and went back inside, leaving the door standing open, a silent invitation for her to follow him into the warmth. The seasons turned. The deep snows of winter melted, feeding the creeks and turning the plains a vibrant, hopeful green. Spring gave way to the long, hot days of summer, and then the air grew crisp again, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of another frost. Inside the house, by the smithy, a new ordinary had taken root and grown strong. It was a life built of small, solid things: the morning coffee, the shared meals, the sound of Maeve's laughter mixing with the steady ring of the anvil. The house was no longer just clean, it was lived in. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table. A row of Alara's preserved vegetables lined a kitchen shelf. Maeve's drawings were tacked to the wall. The sewing basket was no longer on its high shelf. It now sat on a low table by the hearth, its lid often open, a work in progress, a shirt being mended, a patch being applied to Maeve's trousers, resting on top. It had ceased to be a monument to what was lost, and had become a simple, useful part of their shared life. One evening, as the first cold snap of the year settled over the valley, the three of them were in the main room. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, pushing back the encroaching chill. Maeve was asleep on a pallet of blankets on the floor, her cheek pillowed on her arm, the old wooden bird tucked beside her. Alara sat in her usual chair, the basket beside her. She was finishing a new winter cloak for the girl, the deep blue wool soft under her hands. The house was filled with a profound and comforting quiet, the only sounds the whisper of the fire and the soft pull of Alara's needle through the thick cloth. Silas came in from the forge, the cold clinging to his clothes. He was later than usual. He shut the door quietly behind him, careful not to wake his daughter. He brushed the frost from his shoulders and came to stand by the fire, soaking in its warmth. He watched Alara's hands as she worked, the movements as familiar and reassuring to him now as the rising of the sun. She did not look up, but she was aware of him, of his stillness, of the way his presence filled the room. He walked over to where she sat. He looked down at the small cloak she was making, at the neat, even stitches that were a signature of her care. Then he reached down and placed his hand, large and calloused from his work, over hers as it rested on the finished edge of the cloak. It was not a gesture of passion, but of simple, solid presence. A quiet statement of fact in their silent language. She stopped her work. She did not pull away. Instead, she slowly turned her hand palm up beneath his, her fingers curling slightly to meet his. It was a simple, silent acceptance. An answer to a question he had asked months ago, and an answer to all the questions that had come before it. They sat like that for a long moment in the warm, firelit quiet, his hand covering hers. He had not let her leave hungry that first night, and he had been true to his unspoken word. He had never let her be hungry again, for food, or for shelter, or for the simple, profound dignity of being seen, and she, in turn, had finally been allowed to set down the heavy burden of holding everything alone. And that was the story of Alara Kiane, who learned that true belonging is not something you are given, but something you have the courage to choose. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.